The prairie was quiet that evening. So quiet a man could hear the rustle of grass bending beneath the wind, or the faint creak of a saddle when a horse shifted its weight. Out there, under the wide open skies, silence could be as heavy as gun smoke, and just as telling. The sun was dipping low, spilling red light across the horizon, turning the land into a painting of fire and shadow. The cowboy sat tall in the saddle, his hat pulled low, his eyes sharp but weary, had been riding for days, chasing nothing more than a whisper of peace, yet every mile carried with it the weight of the past. He was a man marked by the trail, by dust and by sin, the kind of man folks whispered about in saloons, but never dared to look straight in the eye. He had seen towns rise and fall, preachers come and go, outlaws meet their end beneath gallows or the barrel of a Colt. But nothing had unsettled him the way a small figure standing by a weathered chapel did that evening. The building itself was no more than old stone, patched with wood and faith, leaning against the wind like it could topple at any moment. Yet inside its cracked walls lived a kind of light that didn't belong to the desert. And there, framed in the doorway, stood a nun. She was young, though her veil and plain dress tried to hide it, and her eyes carried something he couldn't quite name. They were neither soft nor stern, but alive in a way that made him pause. As if she could see through every mile he had traveled, every scar on his soul. Cowboy pulled his horse to a stop, dust swirling up around him. Didn't speak at first, just watched her, the way a man does when he doesn't trust what he's seeing. The nun's lips parted, and her voice was no louder than the whisper of wind across the plains. "Do you seek my blessing? Or my body?" The question struck him like the crack of a rifle. His hand, which had been resting near the grip of his revolver out of old habit, froze. The air between them tightened, charged with something he couldn't name. Blessing or body? No priest or preacher had ever dared ask such a thing, and yet here it was, delivered in the calmest voice he'd ever heard. It was not flirtation. It was not mockery. It was something heavier, something dangerous, and it sent a shiver down his spine. The cowboy leaned forward in his saddle, his voice gravelly from the trail. "Lady, you've no idea the kind of questions I carry with me." Her eyes didn't flinch. If anything, they grew stronger, a steady flame in the twilight. "And you've no idea the kind of answers I hold." He swung down from his horse, boots hitting the dry earth with a thud. His spurs jingled faintly as he walked closer, but he kept his distance. As though crossing the threshold of that chapel would mean stepping into another kind of fight altogether. The land around them was empty, but the moment was full, as if the desert itself was listening. Stories about wandering cowboys were common out here. Men chasing gold or vengeance or a home they had lost long ago. But this was no ordinary meeting. This nun was no ordinary woman. There was something in the way she stood, in the way her voice hung between them, that carried both danger and mercy. He had faced gunmen in dusty streets, bandits on canyon trails, and soldiers with eyes as cold as steel. None of them had unnerved him the way this veiled figure did, standing in front of a crumbling church, asking a question that could not be answered without giving away his soul. He tried to laugh it off, a low sound that didn't quite reach his chest. "Blessings don't come easy to men like me." Her voice was still soft, yet every word struck firm. "Or does forgiveness? But a body breaks easier than a spirit. Which is it you want, stranger?" The cowboy's jaw tightened. He had ridden into ghost towns where nothing but bones remained, and he had walked away from gunfights that left blood drying in the dust. But standing there, staring into those steady eyes, he realized that this was a different kind of duel. It wasn't steel against steel. It was truth against lies, soul against flesh. The chapel door creaked behind her as though the old wood itself was groaning under the weight of her question. A crow cawed in the distance, sharp and lonely, before the silence swallowed it again. His horse shifted restlessly, as if sensing something the man couldn't yet admit. The cowboy took one more step closer, dust crunching beneath his boots. He could see her face more clearly now, framed by the fading light. She wasn't afraid. It's not of him, not of the world outside those chapel walls. That alone made her dangerous. He swallowed, his throat dry from the ride, but also from something else, something he didn't care to name. What if I said both? For the first time, her lips curved, not into a smile, but into something more haunting, something caught between sorrow and knowing. She whispered again, but the words trembled like a match waiting to strike flame. then you'll find that either choice will cost more than you can pay." The cowboy felt his chest tighten. He wasn't a man used to backing down, not from bullets, not from the law, not from his own demons. But this wasn't the kind of standoff he could win with a quick draw. Her words dug deep, deeper than any wound he had carried, because they touched on something he had spent years outrunning. The wind picked up, tugging at the edges of her veil, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and dust. The land seemed to hold its breath. In that suspended moment, the cowboy realized he had come searching for something: peace, redemption, maybe even love, but he hadn't expected to find it in the form of a nun standing before a broken chapel, asking him to decide which part of himself he truly wanted to surrender. The silence stretched, every second heavy as stone. He opened his mouth, searching for words, but none came. For once, the man who always had an answer, a retort, a challenge, found himself at a loss. Her gaze didn't waver. "So, which will it be?" The cowboy's hand twitched, not toward his gun, but toward the cross that hung faintly visible around her neck, glinting in the dying light. His heart pounded with a rhythm louder than any gunfight he had ever stood through. He knew that whichever word left his lips next, it would change everything. And just as he drew in a breath to speak, the chapel bell above them tolled, though no hand had touched the rope. The sound rang out across the desert, deep and hollow, like the voice of fate itself, cutting the evening wide open. The cowboy froze. The nun's eyes flicked toward the bell tower, then back to him, steady as ever. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled, though the sky above was still clear. The cowboy clenched his jaw. He didn't know if the sound was a warning, a blessing, or a curse. All he knew was that he had one choice to make, and no road back once it was done. Would he ask for her blessing? Or her body? The desert air pressed in around them, holding the question tighter than any noose. And for the first time in a long, hard life, the cowboy felt afraid not of dying, but of answering. The bell's echo rolled out over the land, fading into the distance, yet its weight lingered. The cowboy stood there with his jaw set, watching the nun as if she held the secret to why the bell had tolled without a hand pulling its rope. His chest rose and fell heavy, his breath mixing with the cooling air. The question she had left hanging between them, blessing her body, did not fade with the sound of the bell. It deepened, burrowing into him, as though the desert itself demanded an answer. She turned her face slightly toward the horizon, where the last red strands of sunlight melted into purple shadow. Her voice was low, steady, but touched by something that felt older than either of them. "This chapel was built long before I came. Some say the bell rings on its own when souls are tested. Some say it calls the truth from a man, whether he's ready or not." The cowboy shifted his weight, the leather of his holster creaking faintly. He wasn't sure if he believed in omens or fate, but he knew what it felt like when the air grew heavy before a gunfight. This was the same weight, but without bullets or steel. He glanced up at the crooked tower, then back at her. "You think that bell's for me?" Her eyes didn't soften. "Came here, didn't you? Men don't ride into the desert without reason." He didn't answer. He couldn't. She was right, though. He had ridden hard, leaving behind towns that spat his name like a curse. Cards gone wrong, whiskey gone bitter, faces of men he'd outdrawn still etched behind his eyelids. He hadn't been looking for a chapel, but somehow the land had steered him here, to this veiled figure who looked at him like she already knew the whole of him. The nun stepped back into the doorway, her hand brushing the worn wood. "You look like a man who carries too many ghosts. They follow you, don't they? Out on the trail in your sleep. You hear them? Same as I hear that bell." The cowboy felt his jaw tighten. He didn't like being read so easily, especially by someone hidden behind a veil. "Lady Ghosts, don't bother me." The living that pulled the trigger. For the first time, she tilted her head, almost curious. "Then what keeps you riding alone?" He opened his mouth, but the words died in his throat. The truth was too tangled to spit out. The years had hardened him into something caught between outlaw and wanderer, a man who belonged everywhere and nowhere at once. He knew how to survive, but not how to rest. The nun stepped fully into the doorway now, the fading light tracing her outline. The chapel loomed behind her, cracked and weathered, but with a strange strength, like it had stood through storms worse than time. She folded her hands together, not in fear, but in calm. "You stand at a door, cowboy? But not all doors lead into shelter. Some lead deeper into fire. Should be careful what you ask of me." The cowboy pulled his hat lower over his brow, trying to shield himself from the way her words cut. He felt like a boy again, standing in front of a schoolmaster, except this lesson wasn't written in chalk, but carved in his bones. He let out a breath and asked, "And what about you? What keeps a woman like you out here, in a broken chapel with nothing but the wind for company?" For the first time, something flickered in her eyes. She didn't look away, but her silence carried weight. When she spoke, it was quieter, edged with something he couldn't name. "I made a vow, but vows don't erase the past, nor do they silence the choices we carry inside." He took a slow step forward, the dust crunching under his boots. The air smelled of old stone and sagebrush. "So you're running too." Her lips pressed together, as though she wanted to deny it, but she didn't. The look she gave him was not anger, not denial, but recognition. For a moment, they weren't Nun and Cowboy, but two souls caught by roads they hadn't chosen, standing in the desert with a question neither dared answer out loud. The chapel bell was still again, but the silence it left behind was louder than thunder. He could feel it crawling under his skin, pressing against the part of him that had always kept moving, never stopping long enough to face what he'd buried. He dragged a hand over his jaw, rough with trail dust. "Maybe I did come for a blessing, or maybe I came for something else. But either way, I reckon you're not what I expected." Her voice dropped to a whisper, softer than the wind. "And you're exactly what I expected." That rattled him. He stiffened, his fingers twitching near his belt, though no weapon was drawn. "What's that supposed to mean?" She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped back into the chapel's shadow. The fading light caught the cross around her neck, flashing once before the darkness swallowed it. "If you want answers, you'll have to walk inside. But know this. Not every man who crosses this threshold walks back out the same." His heart thudded. The cowboy had faced ambushes, lynch mobs, and lawmen, hungry for a bounty. But nothing felt as risky as stepping into that chapel. His horse shifted again, ears twitching, as if warning him to leave. Yet, his boots didn't turn away. The sun sank lower, shadows stretching long across the land. Coyotes yipped somewhere in the distance. The cowboy stood at the edge of the chapel door, the nun's eyes steady on him, her words lingering like the last smoke after a gunshot. Every part of him screamed to ride on, to leave this broken place and its strange keeper behind. But another part, the part he never admitted to anyone, whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was the place he was meant to find. His hand brushed the wood of the doorway. It was rough beneath his fingers, splintered from years of weather and prayer. He glanced one last time at the open land behind him, the kind of horizon that promised freedom yet offered nothing else. Then he looked back at her, standing inside the shadowed chapel, waiting. He took one step across the threshold. The air inside was cooler, carrying the scent of candle wax and old stone. Light filtered through a cracked window, scattering across the pews. The place was empty, yet not empty at all. The silence inside was thicker, like it carried the weight of every prayer ever whispered within those walls. The nun moved quietly ahead of him, her steps certain, her presence calm. She gestured to a pew, but he didn't sit. His eyes roamed the space, from the altar with its chipped wood to the crooked cross hanging above it. The air seemed alive with something he couldn't name, a presence that pressed on him the way no outlaw or sheriff ever had. He muttered, more to himself than her, "Feels like the walls are watching." She stopped in front of the altar, her back to him. "They are. The question is whether you're ready to be seen." His hand curled into a fist at his side. He wasn't used to being seen, not truly. He was used to being judged, hunted, feared, but seen. That was different. That was dangerous. The nun turned, her face half shadow, half light. "So tell me, cowboy, do you seek my blessing or my body?" Her voice was the same as before, calm and unwavering, yet heavier now, weighed down by something that made his skin prickle. His throat tightened. The desert wind moaned faintly through the cracks in the chapel, carrying with it the smell of dust and faraway rain. His chest ached with the choice hanging over him. Though he stood there silent, something inside him shifted. He knew this was no ordinary question. It was not about desire or faith alone. It was about which part of himself he was willing to surrender, and which part he was willing to damn. Before he could answer, the chapel door slammed shut behind him with a force that made the walls tremble. The cowboy spun, his hand flying to his revolver, but no one was there. Only shadows and silence. When he turned back, the nun stood still, her eyes locked on his. She whispered, her voice carrying like a secret buried in the stone. "The bell has already chosen. Now you must decide." The cowboy's breath caught. His hand hovered near his holster. Not because he feared her, but because he feared himself. The air around him pressed tighter, the kind of pressure a man feels before the trigger is pulled. He stood there between the altar and the closed door, trapped between two choices, while the desert night crept in through the cracks. And the sound of that bell seemed to echo faintly in the back of his mind, waiting for his soul to answer. The air inside the chapel grew colder with every heartbeat. Though the cowboy knew the desert outside was still holding the last of its heat. He stood stiff, eyes locked on the nun, unsure if the walls themselves were closing in, or if it was just the weight of her words pressing down on him. The bell's echo seemed to hang in the corners of the room, even though it had stopped ringing long ago. He wanted to ask her what she meant about the bell choosing, but his tongue felt heavy, tied down by the fear of the answer. She stepped closer, the floorboards creaking under her weight. Her eyes stayed steady, but there was a flicker of something else now, a kind of sorrow mixed with determination. "You think this is just a question about faith or flesh? But it isn't. It's a test of what you've been running from." The cowboy's jaw tightened. We wanted to laugh, to spit back a line about how he wasn't running from anything, but he couldn't. Her gaze held him there, pinned, and the silence that followed only made the truth harder to deny. His mind went back to faces he hadn't seen in years. A woman's hand reaching for him as he rode away. A boy watching from the porch as he disappeared down a dusty road. A man's eyes wide with shock before a pistol's smoke filled the air. He carried them all like shadows riding behind him, and he had long believed distance would bury them. But here, inside this broken chapel, every mile he had ever ridden seemed to collapse into one moment. "You've got no right to speak on things you don't know," he muttered, his voice low. Her answer was quick, sharp as a knife. "Don't I? I've stood in silence for years, listening to confessions carved into the air by men just like you. I've seen their sins bleed through their eyes before a word left their lips. You carry the same weight." The cowboy's hand brushed the handle of his revolver, not out of threat but out of habit, as if touching steel grounded him. "If you know so much, then tell me what it is I'm supposed to choose." Her veil shifted as she drew in a breath, and for a moment he thought she might reveal something deeper. But she only said, "You already know. That's why you can't speak it." The chapel door rattled against the wind, though it had been shut tight moments ago. He glanced back, uneasy, but when he looked forward again, she had moved closer to the altar. Her presence filled the room, not loud, not forceful, but undeniable. A sudden memory caught him off guard. Years back, before the weight of his sins had caught up to him, he had wandered into another chapel, smaller than this one, in a town that no longer existed. A preacher had spoken of redemption, but the cowboy hadn't stayed long enough to listen. He had ridden out before the service ended, choosing whiskey and cards over prayers. That preacher was dead now, shot by bandits, and the town reduced to ash. Yet the memory returned like smoke in his lungs. The nun's voice cut through his thoughts. "You're not the first to walk into this place. Others came carrying guns and guilt, and some walked back out, changed. Others never walked out at all." His eyes narrowed. "What happened to them?" Her silence was more chilling than any answer. She turned her head toward the cross hanging crooked above the altar, as though it held the stories she refused to speak. The cowboy shifted his stance, boots scraping against the floor. He felt the tension in the room twist tighter, like a rope winding around his chest. "You said vows don't erase the past. Then what brought you here? You hiding from something too?" For the first time, her steady mask cracked. Her eyes darted away, just for a heartbeat, and that was all the proof he needed. She was carrying her own weight, her own ghosts, though bound up in the black veil of faith. He wanted to press her, to demand answers, but he held his tongue. Somehow he knew her story wasn't one he could force from her lips. Outside, the coyotes called again, their voices sharp against the night. The cowboy wondered if they were circling something out in the dark, or if they were just echoing the hunger he felt gnawing inside him, not for food, but for truth. The nun finally spoke, her words slow and heavy. "You think this is about me and you, but it's larger than that. The land remembers what men forget. Blood spilled on the earth cries louder than words. The bell tolls for those who carry too much of it. The cowboy's stomach turned at her words. He had spilled blood, more than he cared to count. Some of it in self-defense, some of it for money, some of it because he was too quick to draw when pride got the better of him. He had always told himself it was the way of the West, but now under her gaze it felt less like survival and more like a debt waiting to be collected. "Lady," he said slowly, his voice thick, "I didn't ride out here looking to confess. I came because the trail brought me. That's all." Her lips curved, not into a smile but into something close to pity. No trail is aimless. Every mile you ride is a step toward a reckoning. He wanted to argue, but a sound outside cut him off. Hoofbeats, slow, steady, coming closer. The cowboy stiffened, instinct sharpening. He knew the rhythm of horses well, and these weren't wild. Men were riding in. The nun's eyes flicked toward the door. "They've come." His hand gripped his revolver. "Who?" Her answer was barely above a whisper. "The ones who've been following your shadow." The cowboy's chest tightened. He had known men were hunting him, bounty hunters most likely, maybe lawmen with old scores to settle. But how had she known? Hoofbeats grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside the chapel. Silence followed, heavy and dangerous. The cowboy moved to the door, his revolver half drawn. He glanced back at her. "You knew this was coming?" She didn't move, didn't flinch. Every man's past arrives at his doorstep eventually. Yours chose this place. The cowboy's heart hammered as he stood in the chapel, torn between stepping out to meet whatever waited in the dark or staying inside where the nuns' eyes pinned him like a man already judged. Outside, a voice called, rough and cold. "We know you're in there. Step out slow, and maybe we let you keep breathing." The cowboy's grip tightened on his revolver. He looked back at the nun, expecting her to show fear, but she stood calm, almost as if she had been expecting this moment all along. The standoff inside his chest grew sharper than any duel he had fought. If he stepped outside, he would face bullets and men who wanted his blood. If he stayed inside, he would face a question that cut deeper than steel. The nun whispered, blessing her body. "Either way, you must choose before the night ends." The cowboy felt the weight of the desert pressing in, the hoofbeats of his pursuers echoing in his skull, and the silence of the chapel demanding a truth he wasn't ready to speak. His throat burned, his hand ached on the revolver, and his soul felt caught between the gunman outside and the veiled figure inside. And as the door rattled under a heavy knock, the cowboy realized that no matter which way he turned, the cost of his choice would follow him until the end. The knock on the chapel door came again, harder this time, rattling the frame like it might give way. The cowboy's revolver was already half drawn, his knuckles white against the grip. The air inside the chapel had grown tight, as though every shadow on the wall was holding its breath. He could hear the horses outside snorting, restless, and the sound of boots crunching on gravel. At least 3 men, maybe more. He had been hunted before, but never with the weight of a nun's eyes on his back, and a question that burned hotter than a bullet. The nun didn't flinch. She stood calm, her hands folded, watching him as though this moment had been carved into stone long before either of them arrived here. Her voice was steady, too steady for the danger at hand. "If you step out now, you'll face them with steel. If you stay, you'll face yourself. Which battle do you fear more?" The cowboy's jaw tightened. He had no patience for riddles. "Lady, I can't think on my soul when men outside are aiming to cut me down." "Then you'll never be free," she whispered, her words slicing sharper than any blade. The door shook under another blow. Dust fell from the beams overhead, and the chapel groaned as if it too were bracing for what was coming. A voice outside shouted, low and cold, "Last chance, stranger. Step out, or we drag you out." The cowboy's blood surged hot. He had lived most of his life on the edge of a draw, with death always one heartbeat away. But something about this moment was different. He wasn't just fighting for his life. He was standing on the line between damnation and redemption, though he couldn't yet tell which side would claim him. He looked at the nun again. She hadn't moved, but her eyes locked on his, unwavering. "Guns may silence men," she said, "but not the voices inside you. Choose carefully, because both doors lead to blood." The cowboy's stomach clenched. He had never felt so torn. The urge to fight burned in Hammond, instinct honed from years of survival, but the weight of her words gnawed him. For the first time in his life, drawing iron didn't feel like the only answer. Another strike hit the door, this one splintering the wood. The cowboy stepped closer, revolver raised, heart pounding so loud it drowned the silence. His horse whinnied outside, restless, as if it knew what kind of storm was about to break. The nun's voice lowered, softer now, yet even more dangerous. Blessing or body? You must choose before the night claims you. He felt the question clawing at him, demanding an answer. He wanted to push it aside, to bury it beneath the sound of gunfire, but he couldn't. It clung to him like a noose tightening around his throat. The door finally cracked open, the wood giving way. A boot slammed against it from outside, and the gap widened. The cowboy raised his revolver, ready to fire, but froze when a single hand pushed through, pale in the moonlight, gripping the edge of the frame. "Come on out," the voice drawled. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The cowboy's finger hovered on the trigger. He could feel the weight of the nun's gaze pressing against his back, daring him to decide what kind of man he truly was. He thought of the faces from his past, again the woman he left. The boy who watched him ride away, the men he had buried in dust and silence. Every choice he had ever made had led him here, to this broken chapel, to this night where both the law and his soul came calling. The nun spoke again, sharper now. "If you kill them, the desert will take more from you than you can give back. If you walk away, you'll never stop running, and if you choose me, you will never be the same." Her words cut deep, leaving him raw. He didn't know what frightened him more, the bullets waiting outside or the truth waiting inside. The door burst wide open with a final kick, wood shattering as three men stormed into the chapel. They were rough, dusty, faces shadowed under wide-brimmed hats. Guns gleamed in their hands, and their eyes locked on him instantly. The cowboy pivoted, revolver raised, ready to fire, but he stopped cold when he felt the nun step between him and the intruders. Her veil shifted slightly as she held her ground, her hands spread open. "Leave this place," she said, her voice low but carrying, steady as stone. The men sneered, unimpressed. The leader, a tall figure with a scar running across his cheek, spat on the floorboards. "We're not here for you, sister. We're here for him." He jerked his chin toward the cowboy. The cowboy's grip tightened on his revolver. His eyes flicked from the men to the nun, torn between instinct and her unshakable calm. "You'll spill blood on holy ground," she warned. The scarred man laughed, cold and bitter. "Ain't the first time." For a moment the room was frozen, every man poised, every finger ready to pull a trigger. The cowboy's heart thundered, his soul caught in the crossfire. The nun didn't move, her body still the only thing between him and them. The scarred man's voice dropped. "Step aside, sister, unless you want him to die with you." Her eyes flicked toward the cowboy, just for a heartbeat, and he knew the choice was his. He could shoot, kill these men, and maybe survive another night. Or he could lower his weapon, surrender, and face whatever fate awaited. Or he could take her hand and step into something he didn't understand, something that terrified him more than death itself. The tension pressed harder, thicker, until the air itself felt like it might split apart. The cowboy raised his revolver higher, the scarred man cocked his pistol, and the chapel seemed to hold its breath. The nun whispered so faint he almost missed it, "Decide." The cowboy's finger trembled on the trigger. His chest heaved, his throat burned, and in that split second, every sin, every mile, every choice roared back to life inside him. He knew that what he chose now would shape more than this night. It would shape the rest of him if there was anything left after. The scarred man snarled, "Time's up." And in that moment, as the guns hung ready and the chapel's silence cracked under the weight of fate, the cowboy made his move. But whether it would be for blessing, for body, or for blood, the desert had yet to decide. The chapel seemed to collapse into silence in the instant before the world broke open. The cowboy's revolver was raised, his heart hammering like a war drum, and the scarred man's pistol gleamed under the faint light leaking through the cracked window. The nun still stood between them, a shadow of calm in the storm. And for a breathless moment, it felt like time itself had slowed to watch what he would do. Then the cowboy shifted, his decision carving itself into the space like a blade through cloth. His arms swung wide, not to fire, but to strike the lantern hanging crooked near the door. The glass shattered, sparks flying, and the sudden burst of light and smoke filled the room. The intruders flinched, startled, their aim faltering just long enough. The cowboy lunged forward, knocking the scarred man's gun aside with the barrel of his own. Shots rang out, deafening inside the chapel, wood splintering, the air choked with smoke and dust. The fight was quick, brutal, and nothing like the drawn duels of dusty main streets. This was closer, roar, a scramble of fists, steel, and grit. The cowboy moved with the instinct of a man who had fought too many battles to count, each motion guided by survival more than thought. One of the men went down clutching his shoulder, another staggered back with blood streaking his hand. The scarred man fought harder, spitting curses, his face twisted with fury. Through it all, the nun did not scream, did not flee. She stood firm, her eyes burning with something that seemed larger than fear. When the scarred man lunged again, she raised her hand, her voice cutting through the chaos. Enough, the word rang out like the bell itself, striking deeper than the sound of gunfire. The scarred man froze, his chest heaving, eyes flicking between her and the cowboy. For the first time, the fury in his gaze cracked, giving way to something darker fear. The cowboy pressed his revolver to the man's chest, the smoke stinging his eyes. He could have ended it right then. He had ended men for less. Yet as his finger tightened on the trigger, he felt the nun's gaze on him, steady and unyielding. He remembered her words blessing, or body, blood, or mercy, and, for the first time in years, his hand trembled. He lowered the gun. The scarred man blinked, stunned, then snarled, "You'll regret that, cowboy." He spat blood onto the chapel floor and backed away, dragging the injured with him. The others followed, limping, their boots thudding against the wood as they stumbled out into the night. Their horses kicked up dust as they fled, their threats fading into the distance until the desert swallowed them whole. Silence returned, heavy and broken, only by the crackle of the smoldering lantern. The cowboy stood still, chest heaving, revolver hanging limp at his side. The nun moved closer, her presence steady as the earth itself.
No.
She looked at him, not with pity, not with triumph, but with the same unshakable calm she had worn from the start. "You chose," she said simply. The cowboy's throat burned. He wanted to argue, to say he hadn't chosen anything, that he had only acted to survive. But deep down he knew she was right. By lowering the gun, he had made the one choice he had always avoided. He had spared instead of destroyed. He holstered the revolver with a shaky hand, his shoulders sagging under the weight of years. "Doesn't feel like I won anything," he muttered. She stepped past him, her fingers brushing the cracked cross that hung over the altar. "You didn't win, you changed. It's more lasting than victory." He didn't answer. The words struck him deeper than he cared to admit. For so long he had lived by the law of the gun, by the fast draw and the quicker kill. Tonight, for the first time, he had broken that law, and it terrified him as much as it freed him. The chapel smelled of smoke and blood, the floor scarred from the fight. Outside, the coyotes had gone quiet, and the desert stretched endless under the rising moon. The cowboy thought of riding on, disappearing into the horizon like he always had. But when he looked at the nun, still standing calm beneath the broken roof, he felt the trail shift beneath his feet. He asked, his voice rough, "Why'd you stand in front of me? Why risk your life for a man like me?" She turned her eyes to him, the veil shifting in the draft. "'Cause even a man like you can choose differently. Because this place, this night, was never about me. It was about you." The words settled heavy on him. He wanted to scoff, to walk away, but instead he found himself lowering onto a pew, his knees weak. He hadn't realized until then how tired he truly was. Tired of fighting, tired of running, tired of being nothing more than a shadow on the horizon. The nun knelt at the altar, silent, her lips moving in a prayer he couldn't hear. The flicker of the remaining candles cast long shadows across the walls, dancing like spirits that had finally found their rest. The cowboy sat there, listening to the silence, feeling something he hadn't felt in years creep into his chest. It wasn't peace, not fully, but it was the beginning of it, a crack in the armor he had worn too long. When the nun rose again, she turned to him. "You asked for nothing when you came. What you leave with is your choice. Redemption isn't a gift, it's a burden. Carry it or let it fall." He swallowed hard. The words felt like another duel, one he hadn't yet won. But for the first time he thought maybe he wanted to try. The night stretched on, and neither spoke much more. He dozed in the pew, the weight of exhaustion finally pulling him under. When dawn came, the first light broke through the cracks in the chapel, painting everything gold. The nun was still there, sitting quietly, her face turned toward the rising sun. The cowboy rose, adjusting his hat, his body aching but his spirit lighter than when he had arrived. He walked to the door, his boots crunching against the dust. Outside, his horse waited, patient as always, the desert sprawling wide and endless. He paused at the threshold, glancing back one last time. She was watching him, her eyes steady, her presence rooted like the chapel itself. He tipped his hat to her, a small gesture, but one filled with more meaning than he'd ever spoken aloud. "Blessing her body," he said softly. "I reckon it was neither I came for. Maybe it was just a chance to be something different." Her lips curved, faint but certain. "Then go and be it." The cowboy stepped out into the morning, the sun warming his face, the horizon calling once again. But this time, he rode not to outrun his past, but to meet whatever future lay ahead. The chapel faded behind him, its crooked tower standing against the sky, the bell silent but heavy with memory. The nun remained within, a keeper of faith and fire, her question echoing in the cowboy's mind as the hooves of his horse carried him onward. He knew he would always be a man of the trail, a rider between towns and shadows. But now, for the first time, the weight he carried felt different. Not a curse, not a sentence, but a choice. And though the desert still stretched vast and merciless, the cowboy rode on with the sound of the nun's whisper in his heart, a reminder that even the hardest men could be changed, not by bullets or blood, but by a question that lingered long after the gun smoke cleared. "Do you seek my blessing or my body?" The cowboy never answered aloud. But as the horizon opened before him, he realized he already had.